work of art is the trace of a magnificent struggle. The paintings of such masters as Titian, Velázquez, and Whistler are like great documents hurled down. Each is a great decision. They are records of the thought and struggle of an artist. These were the words of Robert Henry, painter and art teacher. Less solemnly, John Singer Sargent defined a portrait as a likeness in which there was something wrong with the mouth. Sargent didn't like to be asked to change what he'd painted. An advocate of Sargent's painting style, Margaret Holland Sargent, one of the nation's leading portraitists, was one of the first women invited to join the prestigious Salmagundi Club. She paints in her magnificent Los Angeles studio. She also teaches portraiture to the annual National Portrait Seminar in New York, attended by artists from all over the world. Among her subjects have been many notables, including Tennessee Williams, Alexander Haig, and for Time magazine, Margaret Thatcher and Gerald Ford.
One day, I got an urgent call from the art director of Time magazine. He wanted me to paint the portrait of President Ford. It was used in their special issue of all the American presidents. This is a photograph of that portrait. That rush job, based on slides that Time provided, caused me to change the way I paint portraits. I used to paint from multiple sittings from life. Well, I still do that now, but in combination with some technical methods. To use the slides that Time provided, I had to black out my studio, and then I projected the slides onto a screen. And over my canvas, I had a little work light. Well, I don't use that system anymore, but it did get me started on new ways to paint portraits. I'll let you in on all my secrets on that a little bit later when we go into the chronicle of the entire process of portraiture. That includes promotion to secure the client, planning the portrait, and then executing the plan with the client. It's impossible to be a professional portrait artist if no one buys your paintings. I'm going to discuss a dozen ways to help you promote and market your services as a portrait artist. If you're like me, you'd love to ignore the need for promotion or let somebody else do it and just concentrate on painting, the fun part. But I found it necessary to get personally involved in securing commissions. Possibly the dividing line between an amateur and a professional portrait artist is the seriousness with which marketing is taken. Also, having to satisfy a paying client helps develop your painting skills. Now, on to those tips on marketing. It's essential to have a presentation book of photographs of your very best work. I have two. This is no place to try to save money. The cover should be of good quality with the photographs under clear plastic to protect them. I keep a variety of photographs in here, including a family of 5, mother and son, a military portrait. I started out by using 8 by 10 inch color photos, but all my new ones are 11 by 14, so my books have both sizes. I'll cover photographing your portraits later. Actually, you might want to have a professional take yours because oil paintings reflect light. Taking pictures of them is tricky. A big problem is that once the portrait is finished, the client usually wants to take the painting immediately, so your pictures have to be taken without delay. Also, if you take them to a professional photographer, you run the risk of damage to a painting the client's already accepted. Well, I solve both problems by taking the pictures myself. Select the color lab that develops and prints your work with care. You'll want precise flesh tones to give the very best impression. And because your clients have taken your work away, this presentation, or brag book as it's called, is the best evidence of the quality of your work. And it doesn't hurt to have a few recognizable names among the subjects in the book. When clients come to visit you to see your presentation book, you should also have some sample portraits hanging on your studio walls. One way is to borrow back portraits temporarily, especially if you're going to have an open house. That's what I did when I had the grand opening of this studio. Another way would be to paint a member of your family, or a self-portrait or two. After all, that's the way Rembrandt got started. He painted nearly 90 self-portraits. Or you could paint a second painting of the same subject. Now, when I completed the commissioned portrait of Terry Mewson, Miss America, she very kindly consented to pose for me again in a different dress for this painting, which I was able to keep.
A framed color photograph of a portrait, if well done, is difficult to distinguish from the real thing. This photograph of the portrait painted for Alexander Haig was printed from a 4x5-inch negative. She used her Crown Graphic camera.
When I first moved to New York years ago, I'm on a California mountaintop now, I had the usual problem of building up a clientele. Well, I wanted to paint, so I joined the Painters Club of New York. They hired models, and this portrait was one of the results.
Painting sample portraits is not the only advantage in joining a painters club. Often the artist can enter shows and get awards that potential clients see on the walls of the studio.
Of course, you could hire a model yourself or get a friend to sit for your sample portrait. This sample is more study than portrait, but shows my versatility. And as a minimum, I recommend you have 3 types of portraits hanging in your studio. The first would be the formal woman's portrait. It wouldn't have to be this large, and it could be standing or cropped about this size, but the male executive portrait, which is the second type, should be seated with the hands showing, or standing with the hands showing. That's very important. I have a variety of chairs used for formal portraits. The third type of sample is the portrait of a child. Now, since my commissions are divided about equally between boys and girls, I suggest you have one of each. Some artists won't even paint children because they fidget and they won't sit still long enough, but the techniques I'm going to tell you about later will help you solve that problem. It also helps to have a teenager sample, and 2 are even better. So far in discussing promotion, I've mentioned your presentation or brag book, your sample portraits. Now, it's essential that you have a business card, because you might make a contact at a social event and you'll want your prospective client to have a way to get back to you. Also, if your friends are helping to promote your talents, they can hand out your cards. Even if a prospective client visits your studio to see your presentation book, you'll want to have something to hand to him to take home to look over. I have a presentation folder that I give to or mail to prospective clients. On the cover is the signature I use on my portraits. It's embossed here, but a printed signature would do and be less expensive. The folder is medium weight, high quality stock. And just inside, I have a brief statement of my goals when I paint a portrait. When the client opens the cover, they see a brief resume, the signature once again with the business address and telephone number. And I have an insert tucked in behind the flap that continues the presentation. The advantage of an insert is that when it's updated, you can still use the basic folder. The cover of the insert poses the question, planning a portrait, then proceeds to give the client several reasons for commissioning a work of art. The signature and address are repeated so that the insert can be used by itself as a junior presentation folder. The insert has 2 folds. In addition to what's on the cover, the insert has 3 other types of information. On the left are the comments of satisfied clients and a small black and white photograph of the artist in studio. The middle portion I call creating the portrait. There I describe very briefly the steps involved in planning and executing a painting. I give an estimate of how long each step will take, well, except for the things that I do on my own, because some clients are very busy, or they're apprehensive about becoming involved in a lengthy process. The first planning session is 1 hour. Now this is where we meet to discuss the function of the portrait, the size and pose and so forth. The first actual sitting is the photographic session. That takes 1.5 hours. Then comes the composition selection, where we look at the previously taken slides, and that I allow 45 minutes. The second actual sitting is a color study, and that's 3 hours. The actual painting of the portrait I do on my own, so I don't give an estimate of time for the client here. Now the third sitting is for the final touches, and I allow 45 minutes. Of course, it could be no time at all if the client accepts the painting as is, or it could run to a couple of hours. On the same page is a sample portrait. This one is of Andrea Holland, the first woman graduate of West Point and a Rhodes Scholar. Andrea stayed as our house guest during the painting. In a section called Reviews are comments from newspapers, magazines, and so forth on my work. In my case, there are extracts from unusual sources like the Wall Street Journal and Money magazine, as well as the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers. You should have color reproductions of your work in your presentation folder. You could use prints from your photo lab. These are lithographs made using color transparencies and separations, an expensive process. Here is the business executive, the formal woman's portrait, and the child, the 3 essential examples. And of course, you should include your price list, what you charge for each size of portrait with the extra charges for hands, additional people, and so forth. I've talked about your presentation folder at length, but I think it's a very important part of staying busy as a professional portrait artist. An excellent way to build up credibility among your potential clients is to have your work reproduced or commented on in newspapers and magazines. Here are some examples. Don't be bashful. If you don't have writing ability, ask a friend or relative to write an article about you for submission, and always send photographs with it. Especially if you paint a well-known person. Send 2 8x10 glossies with brief captions, and along with the article to all the newspapers who are likely to be interested. The ideal situation is to be represented by a portrait gallery, so you have a lot more time to paint. I'm represented by Portraits Incorporated in New York City. So far as I know, they're one of the most prestigious and largest art galleries in the world. They represent 200 portrait artists. Now, when you're satisfied with your presentation book and you have a good sample portrait that you could take to New York, you might ask them for an interview. Teaching others to paint does 3 things. It hones your skills, you get a little extra income, and probably most important, your students become your sales agents. I used to teach painting classes up to about 15 students. Some of my students are now teaching. Now I limit my teaching to the annual National Portrait Seminar in New York City, conducted by John Howard Sandon. Now you may get lots of advice about paid advertising. Well, I may not be the ultimate authority, but I come pretty close to it. The first rule is don't advertise until you're prepared, because when the clients respond to your ad, you'll want to have good examples of your work for them to see and great color photographs to give them. Once you've decided on paid advertising, remember that repetition is the key. Some of my commissions came from people who have been watching my ads in a magazine for 2 years. A one-time ad is a waste of money. Pick the amount you want to spend yearly on ads. Then divide that into 4 or 5 ads in a year in the magazine or theater program or whatever, likely to be read by people in your price range. The ad must have a reproduction, either color or black and white, of one of those 3 classic portraits that I mentioned previously. And you may find yellow pages worthwhile. I know I've talked at length about promoting your artistic talents, and there are just 2 suggestions left. First, follow up by phone on a first-time contact with a prospective client. Suggest that you send them something new to look at, a color photograph, for example. And don't forget your old clients. Keep an address file. Send them a new presentation folder, a Christmas card, and otherwise keep in touch.
It is a must to have business cards available for potential clients. It would be awkward to just hand out the cards. In this case, a third party, enthusiastic about the artist's capabilities, becomes an invaluable ambassador for the artist.
There's nothing wrong with promoting yourself as an artist. It's very much like being an actor. And certainly actors don't succeed by being coy.
If a prospective client shows interest and can't come to her, Sargent goes to the client, taking a presentation book and 1 or 2 sample portraits. But it's better by far for the client to come to the artist's studio. Here are Debbie and her friend Kurt coming to the Sargent studio. When clients visit her, their thoughts are almost entirely concentrated on portraiture. Most of the time, it will be a new experience, a first visit to a portrait artist's studio. There might also be some scenic attractions. In Sargent's case, Griffith Park, the largest city park in the United States, is just across the canyon, with the very beautiful Griffith Observatory adding an artistic touch. For all these reasons, clients feel more inclined to commission portraits when they are not in their own environment. After viewing the sample portraits hanging in her studio, the client reviews Sargent's presentation book. 2 actions are taking place. The client is trying to decide whether to commission the portrait, of course, but at the same time, the client is becoming intrigued by questions like what size, what pose, whether to include hands and how to hold them, and so forth. That involvement helps increase the chance of a commission.
This is no time for high-pressure salesmanship, and I generally leave the client alone, except to answer questions. I usually serve refreshments, including cookies and milk for children.
Once the commissioning decision is made, they immediately start the joint planning of the portrait. Size, pose, dress, background color, the general flavor of the portrait, and price are decided. A time schedule is also set, unless the client is commissioning the painting of someone else who must be consulted.
Well, I have a basic blue silk dress. It's one of my favorites.
Okay. Let's see with that. Do you have any simple jewelry?
I have a string of pearls.
Perfect. Now, let's see. Pearls blue. How about a green background? That'll bring out your eyes.
Oh, that sounds fine. What do you think, Kurt?
I think that'd be great. I think you should also bring your second favorite dress out of the photo session. That way you can have a second choice later.
Oh, can I do that?
Oh, of course, yeah. I was going to suggest that.
Part of the planning to be done is agreeing on a schedule for the 4 times she generally meets with the client. When the planning is done, she usually gets a check for 1/3 of the total price. Under Sargent's system, there are 10 steps in executing a portrait commission. Step 1, planning, has just been completed for Debbie's portrait. Steps 2, 4, and 7 constitute what might be called sittings. But step 2, the photographic session, is used to help settle the many decisions that have nothing to do with painting skills.
The purpose of the photographic session is to get a 35mm color slide of what the client will see when the portrait is finished. That way, the element of surprise is almost eliminated. It's impossible for someone to pose and get an accurate impression of what the portrait might look like. 35mm photography solves that problem. It also permits experimentation with a variety of poses, dress, backgrounds, and facial expressions. And then later, when the slides are made, all the alternatives can be seen within a few minutes. To paint a smile with teeth showing, a photograph of what's desired is almost essential. It's a good idea to plan the shots so the photographic session doesn't exceed 90 minutes. Pick out the background drapes before you start shooting, and of course the subject must have brought all the costumes and jewelry.
Here's her setup when she's not shooting by natural daylight. There's a softbox around the main light to diffuse it. An umbrella light provides soft, reflected light. Even expert photographers bracket exposures. They shoot what is indicated on the exposure meter, then they shoot twice more, one f-stop on either side. Without some acceptable slides, the client will be unhappy. For a portrait of 9 people, a complete family, Sargent took 164 slides. She shoots the hands even though the client might have commissioned just head and shoulders. She'll be prepared if the client decides to have a larger portrait done.
Step 3 is the pose selection session with the client using your 35mm slides. Right now I'm going through them and removing the ones with the bad exposures or those with the eyes closed, so forth. But it's a good idea to leave in a couple that aren't that great. Makes the good ones look even better. Okay, Debbie, when your grandmother commissioned this, she said you were going to select the pose, right?
That's right.
Okay, all ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Here we go. Slide 1. All right, that's the last slide. Why don't we run them again, because you seemed interested in about 10, and then we can pull out the ones you like, and then we'll review those.
That's fine. I saw one I really liked, but I have an open mind.
Okay, here we go. Slide 1. Well, we've narrowed it down to 5 slides.
I'm willing to bet on which one will win.
Here we go.
That's it. That's Debbie.
Oh, I'm very pleased with it, too.
Well, it's my first choice, too. You know, it's amazing. I liked it best from the beginning. It happens quite often. Well, that took 45 minutes, right on schedule. So we'll see you next Wednesday at 1 for the color sketch, okay?
Yes, I'll be here.
Okay.
The next action, step 4, is painting the color study or sketch. The purpose is to record precise flesh tones so that there's a reference when the subject is not present. It may take up to 3 hours, but it's just a head and shoulders. To get the actual colors, the color study is painted in natural light. The color study does not have to be step 4. It could be combined with step 2 when photographs are taken. Likeness is not the objective. The only goal is accuracy of the flesh tones, which will be repeated on the final canvas.
Step 5 of the 10 steps is making a sketch on the canvas. But first you must have something to sketch. Well, you remember I mentioned projecting a slide onto a screen when I was doing the Ford portrait for Time magazine? The problem was I had to black out my studio and use a small light over the canvas, not a very desirable setup. This is a rear projection screen, meaning that the projector is behind this translucent screen. Notice how Debbie's slide is poorly reproduced. That's because so much light falls on the screen surface. The solution is to use a rear projection tunnel like this, with the projector shooting into it from the rear. Now, I had this tunnel made out of lightweight plastic foam panels. It's 2 feet by 2 feet in cross-section and 3.5 feet long. The rear projection screen has been inserted into the tunnel, greatly reducing daylight falling on it. Now, when a slide is projected, the colors are much more brilliant and lifelike. The brightest colors are seen when looking straight down the tunnel. The traditional way is the subject poses for this sketch, but nowadays many subjects are busy or live hundreds or thousands of miles away. Anyway, I found that sketching and preliminary painting without their presence works well for them and for me. Without the rear projection tunnel, this sketch would have been much more difficult to do and probably less likeness. So here's the completed pencil sketch. Now, some people use charcoal or neutral color paint to do their sketching, but I prefer a number 2B pencil. It's faster and less messy. Well, now everything's set up for painting, the 6th step. Throughout the painting process, I continue to use the rear projection tunnel. Now, I'm going to show you Debbie's portrait in 5 more stages. This is the first stage, massing in the background. I use the largest brushes for backgrounds, partly for speed and partly to give texture. Now, I've mixed a basic background color here. In this case, it's a grade green, and I take 3 portions of that. To the first, I add a little yellow, the second, a touch of orange, and the third, a little red. Then, to a 4th portion, I add white, and a 5th, I add a little black, so that I have my basic background color and 5 variations. The light source is coming from this direction and striking the background from right to left. So I've taken the 3 portions of variations of background color, and I've used the yellow, portions with yellow in this area, the portion with orange in this area, and the portion with red in this area. And I've also made a value changes by using some of the white and in the top and some of the black mixed portion in the bottom, because the basic rule is that as light passes across the canvas, it becomes darker and redder the further it gets from the source. One of the basic rules of painting is to get the canvas covered as soon as possible, and you usually work from the larger masses down to the smaller masses. In this case, I've already painted in the background. Then I did the blue of the dress was the 2nd largest mass, and then the hair was painted in. You save the flesh tones until last because they are affected by the surrounding colors. The stage is now set for painting the general shadows and the half tones of the flesh. I'm now painting the flesh tones with 2 kinds of aids. The rear projection screen gives me information on the intensity of color and the placement of shadows and so forth, and the color sketch gives me the precise flesh tones. General shadows and half tones are painted in that order, and because the light is striking mostly from the front, there aren't that many shadows. Now, the general shadows are a single tone, and they go in first because the rule is to paint from dark to light. And next, the half tones are placed, and that's where the shadow side goes into the light side. I'm now massing in the general lighted areas of the flesh. In painting the lighted flesh tones, the colors should be very accurate, and the transitions have to be done very subtly. And you'll notice that the teeth and the whites of the eyes are closer to the flesh tone in value than they are to pure white. You'll notice that to illustrate this, I'll put a dab of white there, and you'll see how out of place that looks. The last 3 additions of paint are the reflected light, accents, and highlights. And the rear projection tunnel helps you to locate where those colors go. Now, since you last saw the painting, I've added reflected light here in the shadows. You know, reflected light is light reflected off flesh or clothing, or from the background into the clothing. And it's nearly always warmer than the object that's reflecting it. Accents are the darkest darks. These are often in the nostrils, in the corners of the mouth, the pupils of the eye, under the ear, and in the hair, and you'll also find them in some places in the clothing and background furniture and so forth. The last colors placed are the highlights. These are the lightest lights, and they occur on the tip of the nose, on the chin, and on the cheek. You'll find them in the hair. They'll also be found in furniture and sometimes in the backgrounds. The last 2 highlights appear in the eyes, and they occur just over the pupils. Now, just before the final sitting, we'll add a coat of retouch varnish. By the time of the final sitting, the paint has begun to dry, leaving dull patches and changing color ever so slightly. So I spray on a few coats of retouch varnish, and that brings the paint up to its original freshness. And I show my clients how to spray several coats of final varnish, but they can't do this before 6 months. The paint has to be completely dry. Now, if they don't live too far away, I volunteer to go to their home or office and do the final varnishing for them. This sometimes leads to another commission. Well, that didn't take too long. Now we're on to step 7, the final sitting.
For the final sitting, the subject comes to the studio with the same clothing and jewelry and poses with the same lighting. Final touches are put on the painting until both artist and client are satisfied. Because the portrait and pictures of it might be used for promotion, the client should be asked to sign a release.
I think adding that highlight on the hair really helped, don't you?
Oh, yes, that's perfect now.
Good.
I think your grandmother's gonna love it.
I hope so.
So far, the first 7 steps in executing a commission have been covered. Planning, photography, pose selection, color study, pencil sketch, painting the portrait and retouch varnishing, and the final sitting. Traditionally, that's when the remaining 2/3 of the price is collected and the mission considered complete. But Sargent continues the march with 3 more steps. Step 8 is to photograph the painting for promotional purposes. It's essential that an excellent color photograph of each portrait be made from 35mm or 4x5 negatives. Sargent takes her photographs against a dark wall to reduce reflections. All natural light is blocked out.
I take my own 4x5-inch pictures with this Crown graphic camera. But if your presentation book is limited to 8x10-inch photographs, you could use 35mm photography. This umbrella light is positioned so that it strikes the canvas at a 45-degree angle and bounces off the other side without entering the camera lens. The light shines onto the umbrella and is reflected onto the surface that you want to photograph. Now this softens the light and eliminates hot spots. If you have a particular problem with reflections, you could use a polarized filter over your lens, or you could use one over the lens in combination with filters over each of your lamps. I always prepare a card that I position above the canvas that I'm photographing that lists the type of film that I'm using, the shutter speed, and the aperture or the lens opening. And I also include a Kodak color control patch and a couple of standard gray cards, because if you're having customized prints made, the photo lab will use all this data to help balance the colors and get you good prints. Now, when you're taking your exposure reading, be sure to hold your meter fairly close to the subject and be sure that you're not taking a meter reading on the shadow that you're casting. I usually take 35mm color slides at the same time that I take my 4x5-inch pictures. It's a great backup, and it also allows me to take a lot of pictures and then pick out the best ones. You can shoot outdoors if you wish. A lot of people get good results that way. But I prefer to shoot inside with controlled conditions so that I can keep all the records and learn by my mistakes. I also shoot 35mm black and white so that I have prints that I can send to newspapers and use for magazine articles. But remember, get your clients to sign a release form giving you permission to use the photographs. I'll just make a few comments about film. For 35mm indoor shooting, I use Ektachrome tungsten. I also use outdoor film for indoor shooting, Ektachrome Daylight ASA 400 and Vericolor 2 Professional Film Type S with an 80A filter for the necessary correction. For 4x5 photography, using my Crown graphic camera, I use Ektachrome and Vericolor 2 Type L. Both of those are for indoors and no filters needed. There's much more to be said about photography and portraiture, but those are the highlights. You should be very interested in getting the best possible frame for your portrait. because a good frame makes the painting look better. And it will please your client. And also, others looking at the painting might become future clients. Oh, and as a service unexpected, why don't you offer to help your client select a frame?
Sargent locates a framer who does high-quality work at a reasonable price. She offers to meet the client at the framers to help in selection. The client may want to do it alone, but 9 times out of 10, the client will want the artist's opinion. The framer may have ready-made frames. It's more likely, however, that the frame will be made to order after the molding is selected. About this time, the artist discusses the advantages of illuminating the portrait. One way is a spotlight on an overhead track. Another is to ask the framer to attach a picture light to the frame. Step 10 is delivery of the portrait to the client. This may be in the studio, at the framers, or in the client's home. The required state and local taxes are collected with the final payment.
A nice touch would be to give your client an 8x10 color photograph of the portrait. You can also offer to take an order for other prints.
With luck, the client will have an unveiling party and invite the artist to attend. Sargent always accepts and usually gets permission to bring a friend with a 35mm camera. Newspapers often send reporters and photographers to social events if they're notified in time. Photographs of artist and subject in front of the portrait can be used many ways in promotion.
It's been a lot of work, but very rewarding to this point. The unveiling party is icing on the cake. Oh, thank you.
A toast to Debbie and her portrait.
And to the artist, Margaret Holland Sargent.
And here's a toast to artists everywhere, a la prima.